Are school children being taught confusing and harmful lies about their gender? The American College of Pediatricians has issued a strongly worded warning against such abuse. The warning is directed at people you would normally consider responsible, including healthcare professionals, educators, and politicians. The pediatricians warn that endorsing gender discordance as normal will confuse children and parents. This will lead more children to attend gender clinics where they will be given puberty-blocking drugs. This, in turn, virtually ensures that they will choose a lifetime of cross-sex hormones and likely consider unnecessary surgical mutilation of their healthy body parts as young adults. The college also warns that cross-sex hormones are associated with dangerous health risks, including but not limited to cardiac disease, high blood pressure, blood clots, stroke, diabetes, and cancer. Rates of suicide are nearly 20 times greater among adults who use cross-sex hormones and undergo sex reassignment surgery. The American College of Pediatricians also states unequivocally that misinforming children about their gender amounts to child abuse. That such a strongly worded warning has been issued indicates that deceiving children about their gender is becoming a common practice. As for your own children, even if they are not presently being subjected to a confusing sex education curriculum at school, that may change soon. A new law is about to be passed in Ottawa that is the first step toward radically transforming sex education across Canada. Confusing teaching materials such as this gender unicorn flyer may become widely used in classrooms everywhere. To protect your children and all Canadian children, you can do 3 things. First, learn everything you can about this problem. Start by watching this entire video. Second, sign the 2 petitions against Bill C-16, for which you'll find links under this video. And third, share this video with your friends and urge them to sign the petitions too. Note that Bill C-16 may seem harmless, but actually it will impact our lives in a number of ways. Most likely, it will allow men to use women's washrooms and change rooms, it will force you to use unfamiliar gender-neutral pronouns, and it will lead to a dangerously confusing gender-neutral sex education for your children. If you refuse to obey this new law, you could end up in prison. The leading opponent of Bill C-16 is University of Toronto professor Jordan Peterson. Here he is informing a Canadian Senate committee about the gender unicorn flyer, which is one of the available teaching materials that are likely to confuse children.
I included this cartoon character that I find particularly reprehensible, aimed obviously as it is at children somewhere around the age of 7.
Now, we all know that men and women have different bodies and different hormones too, which inevitably affect our thinking. Thus, our sense of being male or female, our gender, is influenced by our biology. Here's how Jordan Peterson puts it.
The evidence that biological factors play a role in determining gender identity is, in a word, overwhelming. There isn't a serious scientist alive who would dispute that. Now, you get disputes about it, but they always stem from, essentially, from the humanities. And I've looked at it very carefully. Those arguments are entirely ideologically driven.
In other words, a small percentage of people feel that they are of the opposite sex. They believe that their gender is socially constructed, which means their gender is subjective and changeable, and it doesn't matter whether their body is male or female. Some of these people want to impose their thinking on the rest of us by force. These radical activists include Ontario Premier Kathleen Wynne and the Federal Attorney General and Minister of Justice Jody Wilson-Raybould, who is the sponsor of Bill C-16.
It's a tenet of the ideology that identity is socially constructed, and that's partly why it's been instantiated into law, because there's no way they're going to win the argument. But they can certainly win, let's say, the propaganda war, especially by foisting this sort of reprehensible advertising information on children.
Apparently, we are being governed by unscrupulous ideologues who intend to brainwash our children and pervert our society. Renowned Concordia University professor Gad Saad shares Jordan Peterson's concerns.
Ongoing governmental efforts are pushing for a gender-neutral society to cater to an extraordinarily small number of non-binary or non-gendered people who feel marginalized at having to provide their biological sex as part of their profiles. This is the tyranny of the minority. 99% of the population should acquiesce to having a default feature of their personhood erased because a few individuals might be inconvenienced by it.
The Trudeau government is trying to force an unwanted transformation on our society by stealth. Bill C-16 looks innocuous, but after it is passed, the Justice Department will issue detailed guidelines which will carry the force of law. The new guidelines will be based on the Ontario Human Rights Commission's radical policies, but the federal government has attempted to conceal this disturbing reality, as Jordan Peterson notes.
It's no trivial matter that the Department of Justice's link to the Ontario Human Rights Commission and their statements about how this legislation was going to be interpreted mysteriously disappeared in the middle of December. Of all the things that have happened in relationship to this that I've been studying, I think that was the most chilling, because it was the smoking pistol, right? Because the issue is, what's the right level of analysis? Are you just supposed to look at the legislation? Well, since the Justice Department said, no, you're supposed to look at the surrounding policies, well, that's what I did, and that's what I based my case on. And then all of a sudden, the link tying those two things together just vanished, and people had to go into the Internet archives to fish it back out so that it could remain part of the public record. I think that's absolutely scandalous.
Next, lawyer Jared Brown explains that the radical policies of the Ontario Human Rights Commission are indeed the model for the Federal Department of Justice.
The problem is that in the Government of Canada Department of Justice website, in their questions and answers section of that website, which was pulled down in December, it makes very clear that the definitions of the terms gender identity and gender expression have already been given by the Ontario Human Rights Commission. The Commission has provided helpful discussion and examples that can offer good practical guidance. The Canadian Human Rights Commission will provide similar guidance on the meaning of these terms in the Canadian Human Rights Act. Now, I take that to be a statement of legislative intent.
What he means is that, after the law is passed, the Department of Justice will fill in the details of how the law will be enforced. In other words, they will invent and attach policies at their discretion. Jared Brown explains.
Well, in Ontario, the Human Rights Commission is a policy development creature of the legislature. It creates the policies which interpret the code. But what is most important, the tribunal must follow these policies. It is bound by them. So the Commission creates the law on pronouns. In Ontario, the policies on pronouns were introduced into the legal framework after the law had left the legislature.
In other words, after the Ontario legislature passes a bill, detailed policies are attached to it by the Human Rights Commission. These policies must be followed by the human rights tribunals, which have the power to fine or imprison anyone who does not obey.
Federally, the same process will be followed as the Department of Justice has said so. A similar guideline will be developed. As with the Ontario policies, federal guidelines must be followed by the federal tribunal. The guidelines will mandate pronouns. This will happen after the bill leaves the Senate. Mandating use of pronouns requires one to use words that are not their own, which imply a belief in or an agreement with a certain theory on gender. If you try to disavow that theory, you can be brought before the Human Rights Commission for misgendering, or potentially find yourself guilty of a hate crime. To sum up, on the subject of gender, we're going to have government-mandated speech. Refusing to refer to a trans person by their chosen name and a personal pronoun that matches their gender identity will likely be discrimination.
Thus, we start with Bill C-16 as a vaguely worded law that initially seems fairly harmless, but after it's passed, the vagueness of the law will allow the Minister of Justice to attach whatever specific policies suit her radical agenda. Given that Ontario is the model for this law, we should expect that gender-neutral pronouns will be enforced Canada-wide. In addition, men will be allowed to use women's washrooms and change rooms. The law will also enable those who want to impose a confusing gender-neutral curriculum on all school children. If you resist the law, you could be accused of a hate crime and be brought before the Federal Human Rights Tribunal. If you don't obey the tribunal, you could be held in contempt of court and probably imprisoned.
I knew as a commercial litigator that anyone can end up in jail if you breach a tribunal order. It is a simple civil contempt of court process. People go to jail for this. If somebody says, I'm not going to use those words, are brought before the tribunal, the federal tribunal, and the tribunal then delivers an order for a payment of a fine and alternatively a non-monetary remedy, i.e. cease and desist order, an order to do something, to compel them to do something. And that person who's brought before the tribunal says, I'm not doing that. They will find themselves in contempt of court, and prison is the likely outcome of that process until they purge the contempt.
And I don't understand how the government can justify imposing a criminal penalty on the use of words that no one either knows or uses. It just seems preposterous to me. So I think that's appalling, first of all, because there hasn't been a piece of legislation that requires Canadians to utter a particular form of address that has particular ideological implications before, and I think that it's a line that we shouldn't cross.
People have the right to live as equal citizens under the law. They do not have the right to demand that their identities be coddled and celebrated, lest they might otherwise get offended.
The very idea that calling someone a term that they didn't choose causes them such irreparable harm that legal remedies should be sought, rather than regarding it as a form of impoliteness, that legal remedies should be sought, including potential violation of the hate speech codes, is an indication of just how deeply the culture of victimization has sunk into our society. With regards to respect, you don't meet people, generally speaking, in a mutual display of respect. You generally meet people in a mutual display of alert neutrality, which is the appropriate way to begin an interaction with someone. And so the notion that addressing someone by their self-defined self-identity is necessarily an indication of basic human respect for them, I think is an entirely spurious argument, especially given that there's no evidence that moving the language in a compelled manner in this direction is going to have any beneficial effect. That was part of my original claim, is that there's no evidence that this sort of legal redress, let's say, is going to produce any of the positive consequences that are intended. And I do believe that by making the issue, let's say, painfully visible, that's one way of thinking about it, it's actually had the opposite effect. There's a good chance it'll backfire.
Besides being anti-democratic and anti-free speech in nature, the idea that Bill C-16 will inspire a better Canada for trans people is a dangerous delusion, as it will do the exact opposite.
I think that the danger that's intrinsic to the law far outweighs whatever potential benefit it might produce, especially given that there's no hard evidence whatsoever for any benefit. To me, looking at this from the social science perspective, there's nothing about it that's credible. And I also don't buy the intent. So the people who are promoting this legislation claim to be acting on the behalf, say, of the transgendered community, but they weren't elected nor appointed to act as such representatives and are doing it on their own say-so. I've received many letters, at least 30 now, from transgendered individuals indicating that they are not in accordance with the claims of these so-called representatives or with the intent of the legislation, which has actually made them more visible rather than less visible, and the less visible is what they had preferred.
An act to amend the Human Rights Act and Criminal Code threatens the very process by which individual voices inspire change in a democratic society.
I think that the inclusion of gender expression in the bill is something extraordinarily peculiar, given that gender expression is not a group and that, according to the Ontario Human Rights Commission, it deals with things as mundane as how behavior and outward appearance such as dress, hair, makeup, body language, and voice, which now, as far as I can tell, open people to charges of hate crime under Bill C-16 if they dare to criticize the manner of someone's dress, which seems to me to be an entirely voluntary issue.
Of particular concern in the area of human rights law is that a lack of clarity will cast a chill on the exercise of the fundamental freedoms, such as freedom of expression and religion.
With regards to the chill, it's already the case, and I've seen this among my own students when they're teaching personality, which is what I teach, which also involves assessment of gender differences between men and women, that the proclivity now is for the advanced PhD students to avoid any such discussions in their classrooms because the potential cost of transgressing against an unknown norm, let's say, is so high that it's just easier to teach other things.
I live in the trenches of academia, and I see how terrified my colleagues are of uttering a single word out of place lest someone will be offended. That's wrong, and we should stop it.
If the identity claims that are instantiated in the policy surrounding this legislation are applied, it's going to be very difficult for the biologists and the psychiatrists next. And I think we'll see that happening very soon. The ideologues who are pushing this movement are using unsuspecting and sometimes complicit members of the so-called transgender community to push their ideological vanguard forward, and I firmly believe that. So I'm not participating in that. And the fact that it's potentially illegal for me not to participate in that is something that I regard as, I think that's absolutely dreadful. It puts a shudder in my heart as a Canadian that we could even possibly be in a situation like that.
Bill C-16 is a threat to our children, a threat to our freedom of speech, and a threat to our way of life. So please sign both petitions now, share this video with your friends, and ask them to sign the petitions too. Let's act together to defeat this bill or have it repealed after the Trudeau Liberals are defeated in 2019. Thanks for watching, and thanks for sharing this video. Feel free to click the like button and the subscribe button too. Thank you.